What happens when an outspoken atheist professor mocks religion in front of a man whose faith is unwavering? When Habib Nurmagomedov enters a debate he never asked for, the professor thinks he has the upper hand until Habib responds with something so powerful that everyone in the room is at a loss for words. Stay tuned, because this is a moment you won't forget. The air was crisp, with a cool touch of fall, as Habib Nurmagomedov's black SUV pulled up to the gates of one of the most prestigious universities in the world. The towering stone buildings covered in creeping ivy stood as monuments to knowledge and history. Students in coats and scarves hurried along the paved walkways, their breath visible in the cold afternoon air. Some had books under their arms, while others sipped coffee, engaged in deep discussions. It was an atmosphere of intellect, debate, and curiosity, exactly the place where ideas collided, where minds were tested. Inside the large lecture hall, the setting was simply majestic. The architecture bore the weight of centuries with its high ceilings, wooden beams and rows of bookshelves along the walls. The stage, set in the center, was lit with warm yellow light, with 2 chairs placed for guest and host. Hundreds of students had gathered. Their excited whispers filled the room. Some were here because they admired Habib's discipline and his undefeated MMA career. Others were skeptics, eager to see how a fighter known for his devotion to his faith would thrive in a place where logic, philosophy, and science rule. Habib stepped out of the SUV, dressed in a simple black suit and white shirt. His presence was quiet but commanding. He didn't need flashy jewelry or designer brands to prove his worth. His legacy spoke for. His close team, including his manager and a few security personnel, followed behind him, ensuring a smooth entrance. Habib didn't look back too much. He just walked with a steady purpose, his focus unwavering as had been throughout his career. As he entered the building, the murmurs of students grew louder. Some pulled out their phones, hoping to capture the legend. Others simply watched, intrigued by his calm and composed demeanor. Despite being one of the most dominant fighters in history, Habib was acting humble. He wasn't here to fight. He wasn't here to debate. He was here to share his perspective on the discipline, faith, and way of thinking that had shaped his path. But there was one person in the room who saw this as an opportunity for something completely different. In the center of the stage, sitting in a relaxed pose and with a smug expression on his face, sat Dr. Richard Coleman, a philosophy professor and well-known atheist. In his nearly 50s, with graying hair and a sharp gaze, Coleman had built a reputation as an intellectual heavyweight. He wasn't just a professor. He was a provocateur. He prided himself on challenging religious beliefs, using logic and reason to demolish faith in front of packed lecture halls. Many students admired his brutal honesty, while others found his approach harsh, even arrogant. For Dr. Coleman, religion was nothing more than an outdated belief system, a relic of a time when mankind lacked the tools to understand the world scientifically. He set out to expose faith as nothing more than wishful thinking for what it really was, an illusion for those who couldn't handle reality. And today, he saw the perfect opportunity. As Habib took his place on the stage, the professor leaned toward the microphone. There was an unmistakable condescension in his voice. "Before we begin," Dr. Coleman said, adjusting his glasses, "I have to say, it's rare these days to see a world-class athlete who still holds religious beliefs. I guess when get hit over the head enough, it becomes harder to think rationally." A wave of laughter swept through a small portion of the audience. Some students chuckled nervously, while others fidgeted in their seats, sensing the tension in the room. Habib, however, remained perfectly still. His expression didn't change. His hands rested calmly in his lap. Dr. Coleman smirked, as if he had already won. He continued. His tone was full of amusement. "Let's be honest. Religion is an outdated concept. Science has given us the answers. Logic has set us free. And yet people like you continue to insist on believing in things that have no proof. Tell me, Habib, as a fighter, don't you rely on facts? Training, discipline, strategy. If you applied the same logic to life, you'd realize that faith is simply wishful thinking. Silence. The room grew heavier. Even those who might have agreed with the professor's opinion felt that he had crossed the line. This was not a discussion, this not intellectual curiosity. This was an open attempt to mock Habib's beliefs in front of a packed audience. Everyone turned to Habib, expecting a reaction. Maybe anger, maybe defense, maybe argument. But instead Habib just sat there, an almost mocking expression on his face for a moment, and then he spoke. For a moment there was complete silence in the hall. The weight of the professor's words hung in the air, lingering like an intruder. Some students fidgeted in their seats, sensing that something was about to happen. Others glanced around, not knowing what to expect. But Habib remained motionless. His face was impenetrable. His hands were clasped together, his posture relaxed. But his eyes were something that made even those in the back rows feel the tension of the moment. Then he leaned forward slightly. His voice was calm but firm. "Professor," he said. There was no anger in his tone, only calm certainty. "You talk as if faith and logic cannot exist together, as if belief in God means abandoning reason. But tell me, have you ever stepped into a cage?" A murmur ran through the audience. Some students smiled understandingly, sensing where this was going. Others straightened up, their curiosity heightened. Dr. Coleman raised an eyebrow. "A cage? You mean like an animal?" He smirked. "No, I can't say I am." Habib nodded slowly. "Yes, I suppose you wouldn't. But let me explain something to you." He gestured with his hands. His movements were controlled, deliberate. "When I go into the octagon, I know one thing for sure. I don't control everything. I train, I prepare, I strategize. But when the cage door locks, anything can happen. One mistake, one miscalculation, and it's over. So tell me, Professor, when a fighter goes into the cage, does he rely on logic alone?" Dr. Coleman grinned. "Obviously, he relies on skill, experience, and training. That's what wins fights, not prayers." Habib smiled slightly, as if he had expected that answer. "Yes, skill and training matter, but even the best fighters in the world lose. Sometimes an unexpected blow hits. Sometimes something happens that's beyond their control, and that's where faith comes in. No matter how much you prepare, no matter how much you learn, there will always be things that are beyond your understanding, beyond your control, and that's true not only in combat, but in life." The professor squirmed in his seat. The smirk on his face faded slightly. Habib continued. His voice was steady and unwavering. "You say that science has given us the answers, and I agree. Science is important. It helps us understand the world. But science has not answered all the questions. Science can't tell you what happens after death. Science can't explain why two people with the same disease, with the treatment, have different outcomes. Why one survives and the other doesn't. And science cannot explain the feelings of a mother praying for her child, hoping for something beyond medicine, beyond human possibility. So tell me, Professor, are these people fools? Are they irrational?" Dr. Coleman hesitated. He wasn't used to being questioned in this way. Usually his debates followed a predictable pattern. He would challenge, the other man would fight to defend his faith, and he would come out victorious. But Habib was different. He didn't argue with emotion. He wasn't trying to prove anything. He was simply stating the truth as he knew it, a truth that didn't need confirmation in the lecture hall or applause from the students. "I'm not saying people are fools," Dr. Coleman finally said, adjusting his glasses. "I'm saying that relying on faith is unnecessary when we have logic." Habib shook his head slightly. "Then tell me, Professor, do you control everything in your life? Do you wake up knowing that nothing unexpected will happen, that you won't get sick, that you won't get hit by a car on your way home, that your heart won't stop beating for no reason? The professor didn't answer. Habib leaned back. The expression on his face became thoughtful. You see, the difference between you and me is that I accept that I am not in control of everything. I accept that there is something bigger than me, something beyond my comprehension. That doesn't make me weak. It makes me humble. It makes me ready for whatever happens. But you... Habib tilted his head slightly. You live with the illusion of control. You believe that if you can't see something, it doesn't exist. But tell me, Professor, do you believe in love? Dr. Coleman blinked, caught off guard. Of course I do. Habib nodded. Can you prove it? Can you measure it? Can you show it to me under a microscope? Silence. Habib's voice softened, but his words had weight. Not everything real can be seen. Not everything true can be measured. And just because you choose not to believe doesn't mean something doesn't exist. The room was completely silent. Dr. Coleman opened his mouth as if about to respond, but no words came out. For the first time in his own classroom, in front of his students, he had no answer. And Habib, he just sat there, untouched, unshaken, because he never came here to win an argument. He came here to say. The truth, and the truth, needed no defense. The silence in the hall was deafening. No one had expected this, not the students who had come to watch their professor trash another believer, not the professors who had seen countless debates where faith was dismissed as outdated superstition, and certainly not Dr. Richard Coleman, who was now frozen in his seat. His usual smirk had completely disappeared from his face. For years, the professor had prided himself on his ability to debunk religious arguments with cold, hard logic. He had argued with theologians, philosophers, and scientists, and always walked away from the debate feeling victorious. But today was different. Habib didn't come to the debate. He didn't come armed with complex theological theories or academic arguments. He simply spoke from experience, from faith, from an unshakable confidence that no amount of reasoning could shatter. And that's what made him so powerful. Dr. Coleman cleared his throat, gripping the arm of his chair. He tried to regain his composure, but it was clear he was struggling. Well, he began, and his voice lacked its former confidence. I suppose that's one way to look at it. Habib didn't answer immediately. He let the professor's words hang in the air for a moment before he spoke again. His tone was calm, but shrill. It's not just way of looking at it, Professor. It's reality. Heavy pause. The professor exhaled sharply, squeezing out a chuckle. You're a tough guy, I'll give you that. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his chin. I'll admit, I didn't expect this conversation to go this way. Habib just nodded. That's because you thought I was weak. The professor blinked. Excuse me? Habib's expression remained impenetrable. You thought that because I was religious, I was naive, that I was easily broken. But faith is not weakness. Faith is strength. A man who relies only on himself will fall the moment life gives him something he cannot handle. But a man who believes in something greater than himself, he is unshakable. The gravity of those words seemed to sink in on everyone in the room. Even the students who had laughed earlier now sat in quiet reflection. Some of them had grown up with faith, only to abandon it in the pursuit of logic. Others had never believed at all, but right now, in this moment, they weren't so sure. The professor exhaled slowly, rubbing his hands together. He looked at the crowd as if searching for, maybe comfort, maybe a way out, but all he found were wide-open eyes waiting for him the next step. And for the first time in his long career, he had nothing to say. Suddenly, the silence was broken by a voice from the hall. Professor, do you still believe that faith is stupid? The question was asked by a young woman sitting in the second row. Her eyes were fixed on the man who had once convinced her that God was nothing more than a myth. Others in the audience turned their attention back to Dr. Coleman, waiting. The professor swallowed hard, squirming in his chair. He hesitated. He looked at Habib, who just sat there, calm as ever. No smugness, no gloating, just confidence. Finally, Dr. Coleman exhaled, looking down at his hands. "I think," he murmured, as if to himself, "I think I need to rethink a few things." The whole room froze. There was no applause, no dramatic reaction, just silence, because everyone present knew that they had just witnessed something important. Habib stood up, adjusting his suit. He turned to the professor, extending his hand. "We all seek the truth, Professor. It just takes some of us longer to find it." Dr. Coleman hesitated. Then he slowly reached out and shook Habib's hand. And in that moment, everyone in the room realized. This was not just another argument. This was something much, much deeper. When Habib walked out of the lecture hall, he left behind more than just words. He left behind a shift in perspective, a crack in the seemingly unbreakable wall of skepticism that Dr. Coleman had been building for years. It wasn't about winning an argument or proving someone wrong. It wasn't about ego or dominance. It was about something much deeper. The realization that faith is not a weakness, but a strength. That logic and faith are not enemies, but two forces that coexist in the lives of those who truly seek truth. For the students in that room, this was not just another philosophy class or religious argument. It was a moment that they will carry with them for years to come. Some left questioning their own beliefs, some left with a new respect for the faith, and others left in quiet reflection, but no one left unchanged. As Dr. Coleman, he has spent his entire career tearing down belief systems, but in one conversation he was led to question his own confidence. Maybe he wouldn't change overnight. Maybe he'd never admit it out loud. But one thing was certain. He had just met a man whose faith was stronger than any argument, and that more than anything else shook him to his core. It wasn't just an argument. It was a reminder that some truths go beyond what can be measured, beyond what can be proven. Some truths need to be felt,